Well, let's talk about what is going on here in the U.S. The cost of living rose more than expected in December on higher energy and food prices. We talked a little bit about this with Mike McKee earlier. Well, most governments issue these monthly inflation reports, but there are two economists at the MIT Sloan School of Management. They track online prices of millions of items on a daily basis. It's called MIT's Billion Prices Project. It was launched back in 2007, and it monitors and tracks about 5 million individual items sold by 300 online retailers in more than 70 countries. Well, Professor Alberto Cavallo is one of its creators. He's an assistant professor at the MIT Sloan School of Management, and he joins us now from our Boston newsroom. Welcome, Professor Cavallo. Good to see you this Friday.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in the show.
Well, I know some say that this is a more accurate predictor of inflation, but why even focus on CPI and look at all these prices in the first place?
Well, obviously, CPI is one of the most important measures of inflation around the world. It's the one central bankers monitor all the time to decide policy. And on the other hand, we also have retail prices, so it makes perfect sense to just focus on CPI.
Now, why is your index, or let's start with how is it different and why would it be better? It seems to be more comprehensive, but you are looking at online prices.
No, it has certain differences with the CPI. I wouldn't say it's better. It has, for example, the advantage of being able to update itself on a daily basis. We collect these hundreds and millions of prices from hundreds of retailers, and we update them immediately on a daily basis. So for some categories of goods which are well represented online, like food, electronics, clothing, it certainly has an advantage in terms of anticipation, no? And in some other countries, for example, it could be a good way to create alternative inflation indexes, especially if you or the people are suspect that something is wrong with the official estimator.
And I think we have a graph here that looks at your index versus CPI. What can you tell us about this morning's release of CPI? Is that what your index was already predicting?
Well, in a sense, yes. The overall message is that inflation is relatively stable for now. It's not a big problem in the U.S. You can see it in our index. It has been stable for a long time, and that's also reflected in the CPI. The core is very stable. Of course, in the months to come, there will have to be a lot of emphasis in looking at what is going on with energy prices and food prices. But from what we can see already in the prices of January, food is relatively stable, and it will probably remain so for the next few months. It's not a major concern.
Now, it did look as if, when we looked at that first graph there, it did look as if your index is actually tracking slightly higher than CPI. Is that true?
Well, that's in terms of the level. That's correct. For several months, it has been around 2%, while the CPI is around 1.5 or 3. But there are many reasons why our index is different. The major one is that we don't necessarily cover exactly the same categories of goods. We cannot find online the prices, for example, of medical costs or transportation or education. So, and in fact, food is a category of goods that has a greater weight in our index than in the CPI. So in terms of levels, it makes sense to expect temporary differences. But the main point is that if you look at it over the past few months, it has been very stable. So
Professor Cavallo, let me jump in for just a moment. Didn't mean to cut you off there, but you know, a lot of people do criticize, or a lot of what we do here in the media when we do talk about economic indicators is we have to explain away some of the aberrations there, and people have said maybe the government or other institutions need to maybe revamp the way they look at the economy. Do you think are others approaching you? Is the government approaching you? Are hedge funds approaching you, or investment managers to maybe adopt your index and use that as a way to sort of think about their trades?
Well, we have been receiving a lot of interest from people in the business sector and also in the government. Of course, there are some advantages in some of the indexes we can create online, but I see it more as a complementary to the traditional methods. This is all very brand new. We still don't know many of the implications that it will have. But certainly for some categories of goods, it has clear advantages over traditional methods, and you will see hours and more real-time indicators being used by governments around the world.
All right, thanks so much, Professor Cavallo, for joining us here on this Friday. This is Alberto Cavallo of the MIT Sloan School of Management.